Some say that the measure of a man is weighed in the gold he can easily place into a woman's soft hands. But out here in the shadowed, quiet belly of the sprawling valley where the wind howls down from the jagged, unforgiving peaks and the morning frost settles thick and heavy upon the brittle prairie grass, and the ancient rivers run numbingly cold with the pale meltwater of 1,000 forgotten winters, a man's true worth is tallied in the deep, unyielding calluses on his palms and the resolute stillness of his jaw. Elias was a man built entirely of that very frost and dark dirt, a stoic creature of quiet habits and rigid, unspoken routines who understood the complex, silent language of the dry soil far better than the frantic, hollow chatter of the modern world encroaching on the borders of his isolated town. And he possessed a profound, enduring stubbornness, a deeply ingrained trait that had kept his family's failing, heavily mortgaged farm, barely breathing through decades of relentless drought and mounting debt and merciless, scorching summers that baked the valley clay into cracked, unyielding pavement. He was a man who spoke rarely, preferring to let the steady swing of his heavy iron hammer and the precise, deliberate mending of his broken wire fences speak for his character, moving through his solitary days with a grounded competence that required no audience and sought no praise from the passing townsfolk who often whispered about his inevitable ruin. Clara was the only daughter of the local, aging mercantile owner, a woman of quiet, striking dignity and sharp, observant hazel eyes who moved through the cluttered aisles of her father's dusty store with a steady, unhurried grace that commanded immediate respect without ever once raising her voice or demanding it from the rough farmers who came to barter for their winter supplies. They did not fall in love in a sudden, theatrical crash of summer thunder or a fiery, destructive burst of reckless, youthful passion, but rather they grew steadily into one another over the passing seasons like two ancient, weather-beaten oaks planted far too close together by an absent-minded creator, their roots slowly tangling and weaving beneath the cold earth in the absolute dark where no one else could possibly see, until it became entirely impossible for anyone to tell where his silent foundation ended and her steadfast strength began. She would frequently come out to the isolated farm on the slow, quiet afternoons of Tuesdays and Thursdays under the thin, transparent guise of delivering the heavy burlap supplies her father had supposedly overstocked by sheer accident, bringing heavy, dusty bags of milled flour and rusted, dented tins of cheap black coffee, and sometimes a single, slightly bruised red apple that she would leave carefully balanced on the splintering wood of his front porch railing without ever saying a single word to announce her arrival. He would inevitably find these quiet, practical offerings at the end of a grueling day in the sun, and his broad chest would tighten painfully with a heavy, unspoken gratitude that he could not name, and he would purposefully return the neighborly favor by quietly fixing the sagging, rusted hinges on her father's heavy store door in the dead of night, or methodically replacing the rotted, dangerous floorboards on the back loading dock, neither of them ever openly acknowledging the ongoing exchange of hard labor and necessary goods as anything more than basic, neighborly obligation. Yet, the heavy air between them always hummed with a quiet, observant tension, a slow-building, electric current of mutual respect that manifested entirely in polite but sharply pointed banter about the changing, unpredictable seasons and the sheer arrogance of the dark storm clouds that constantly promised heavy rain but delivered only dry, mocking lightning that set the distant ridges ablaze. It was an earnest, deeply nostalgic dance of routine, a rhythmic, synchronized swaying of two highly capable, fiercely independent souls who clearly recognized the exact same deep competence in the other, constantly communicating their budding, undeniable affection through the careful, deliberate stacking of winter firewood and the meticulous, stubborn mending of broken perimeter fences, establishing a linear, inevitable progression of unspoken promises that laid the heavy, vitally important groundwork for a quiet story that would span the entirety of their long lives, beginning not with a grand, sweeping, romantic declaration, but with the simple, stubborn refusal to let the other face the crushing, relentless weight of the world entirely alone. The slow, deliberate passage of time in the valley was marked not by the ticking of a parlor clock, but by the changing colors of the vast, open sky and the shifting shadows cast by the western ridge, and as the gentle spring slowly surrendered to a harsh, baking summer, the unspoken rituals between Elias and Clara only deepened in their quiet, rhythmic complexity, becoming the very anchor of their, otherwise grueling, isolated existences. He would inevitably be waiting by the rusted iron gate when her father's old, rattling delivery truck crested the dusty hill, leaning heavily against the weathered wooden post with his worn leather hat pulled low to shield his eyes from the blinding, merciless sun, pretending that he just happened to be resting at that exact, precise moment, and she would kill the struggling engine with a knowing, subtle smirk that barely touched the corners of her mouth before stepping down into the ankle-deep, powdery dust. Their conversations were always remarkably sparse, heavily laden with layers of unspoken subtext, and entirely devoid of the trivial, meaningless gossip that consumed the rest of the small, suffocating town, focusing instead on the practical, immediate realities of their shared environment, like the dropping water level in the eastern reservoir or the concerning, yellowish tint to the leaves of the struggling cornstalks. "That old gate's leaning further south than a migrating bird," she would remark casually, wiping a smudge of grease from her pale cheek and looking out over the dry, sprawling acreage, completely ignoring the intense, quiet way he was watching the sunlight catch the loose strands of her dark hair, and he would merely grunt in agreement, adjusting his heavy leather work gloves and replying in a low, even rumble. "Wind pushes it, but the post holds deep, and it'll stand as long as it has to." This became their unique, private language, a continuous stream of dry, situational humor that relied heavily on gentle irony and the stubborn, amusing repetition of minor daily disagreements, where arguing over the proper, most efficient way to stack 50-pound feed bags became a profoundly intimate act of intellectual sparring, a way of proving their matched wits and shared endurance without ever risking the vulnerability of baring their softer, guarded hearts. He knew precisely how she preferred her coffee, brewed painfully black and bitter enough to strip the paint from a barn wall, and he always made sure a dented tin cup was waiting for her on the porch railing whenever she stayed long enough to help him unload the heavy truck, while she knew exactly which of his left shoulder muscles ached terribly when the barometric pressure dropped before a storm, and she would subtly, effortlessly shift the heavier burdens toward his right side without ever drawing attention to his hidden physical weakness. It was a fiercely protective, intensely private dynamic, built entirely on a foundation of profound observation and silent, unwavering support, where the loudest, most meaningful statements were made without a single vibration of the vocal cords, proving time and time again that the truest form of romantic devotion is not found in poetic, flowery sonnets or expensive, gleaming jewelry, but in the steadfast, reliable presence of someone who simply refuses to walk away when the work gets unbearably hard and the sun beats down like a physical, heavy blow. But the quiet, insulated sanctuary of their unspoken bond was abruptly, harshly threatened by the sudden, disruptive arrival of the changing times, heralded by the suffocating dust of a sleek, pristine automobile rolling into the sleepy, forgotten town, carrying Arthur, a wealthy, charismatic merchant from the bustling, distant city who had come to expand his family's booming textile empire into the rural, untapped valleys. Arthur was everything that Elias was not: loud, impeccably dressed in fabrics that had never known the harsh reality of dirt or sweat, quick to laugh with a booming, theatrical voice, and exceedingly eager to make grand, performative declarations of his overwhelming admiration for anyone who would stand still long enough to listen, and his ambitious eyes very quickly, inevitably settled on Clara, recognizing her quiet dignity not as a matching strength to partner with, but as a beautiful, rare prize to be conquered, acquired, and displayed. The stark, jarring contrast between Arthur's loud, ostentatious wealth and Elias's quiet, suffocating poverty became an immediate, unavoidable tension in the humid valley air, drawing the nosy, gossiping eyes of the entire town who watched with bated breath as Arthur began to aggressively court Clara, arriving at her father's mercantile daily with extravagant, imported gifts of fine, delicate silks, and out of season, expensive fruits that belonged in a wealthy parlor, not on a dusty wooden counter smelling faintly of kerosene and dried feed. Elias watched this loud, colorful spectacle from the quiet, dark periphery, leaning silently against the rusted cab of his dying tractor. His jaw set so tightly that the muscles fluttered visibly beneath his sun-baked skin, feeling the crushing, humiliating weight of his perpetually empty pockets and the looming, terrifying reality of his failing farm bearing down on his broad, weary shoulders with an intensity that threatened to finally, completely break his stubborn spirit. He made no sudden, dramatic moves to intervene or foolishly fight for her attention, driven entirely by a deeply flawed but fiercely noble sense of stoic pride that falsely convinced him he had absolutely no right to stand in the way of a woman's opportunity for an easier, softer life, mistakenly believing that his profound, enduring silence was a final, selfless act of love rather than a cowardly, fearful retreat from the terrifying prospect of ultimate rejection. Clara, however, remained profoundly unimpressed by Arthur's glittering, shallow displays of immense wealth, accepting his expensive gifts with a polite, detached coldness that completely failed to mask her fundamental lack of romantic interest. Her sharp, observant eyes constantly, inevitably drifting past Arthur's expensive, tailored shoulder to search the dusty, empty street for the familiar, comforting sight of a battered, sun-faded leather hat and a pair of broad, familiar shoulders that seemed to effortlessly carry the weight of the entire sky. The summer stubbornly, viciously dragged on, morphing from a standard, expected heat wave into a brutal, historic drought that mercilessly cracked the earth open like a dried, lifeless sponge, turning Elias's once promising green fields into a barren, desolate wasteland of brown, crumbling stalks and choking, swirling red dust that coated everything in a fine, suffocating layer of despair, pushing his already precarious financial situation past the point of simple hardship and into the terrifying, absolute realm of total, undeniable ruin. The local bank, driven by cold, unfeeling numbers rather than neighborly compassion, began to send thick, formally typed letters sealed in stark white envelopes that Elias would silently, methodically toss unopened into the roaring belly of his iron wood stove, watching the crisp paper curl and blacken into ash with a hollow, empty gaze, knowing with a sickening certainty that the inevitable foreclosure was creeping closer with every single, rainless day that dawned bright, clear, and mockingly blue. Despite the crushing, suffocating reality of his impending failure, Clara continued her quiet, steadfast deliveries, bringing more practical supplies than ever before, using her own modest, saved wages to secretly pay her father for the extra provisions, quietly slipping bags of essential seed and heavy, crucial tools into the back of Elias's barn when he was out fiercely, pointlessly battling the unyielding dirt in the lower fields, stubbornly refusing to let him starve simply because his flawed pride would not allow him to ask for desperately needed help. Elias, completely blinded by his own growing, toxic shame and the loud, persistent whispers of his own insecurities, began to slowly, painfully pull away from her, abruptly cutting their precious, sparse conversations agonizingly short, turning his back to her when she approached the porch and retreating deeply into the dark, solitary confines of his own mind, falsely believing that by pushing her away, he was somehow bravely saving her from the sinking, doomed ship of his own miserable, ruined life. The slow-building, unspoken tension between them swelled to an almost unbearable, suffocating pitch, hanging thick and heavy in the dry, dusty air like the oppressive, static electricity right before a massive, violent thunderstorm, completely overshadowing the daily routines and quiet banter that had once safely, comfortably anchored their lives, setting the isolated stage for an inevitable, painful collision of extreme stubbornness, misplaced nobility, and desperate, quiet love. But before we wade into the heavy, suffocating dust of that terrible, fateful afternoon when everything finally broke open, I want to pause the narrative for just a brief, quiet moment and directly ask you, the listener, to scroll down and leave a comment telling me exactly where in this wide, weather-beaten world you are watching from tonight, because there is something deeply, profoundly comforting in knowing that this isolated, forgotten story of quiet endurance is resonating in crowded, noisy cities and lonely, quiet towns far beyond the borders of this dusty valley, bridging the vast, lonely gaps between our completely different lives through the shared, universal understanding of what it truly means to weather a heavy storm. Now, returning to the parched, cracked earth of the valley, the inevitable breaking point finally arrived on a blisteringly hot, unforgiving Tuesday when the ancient, rusted engine of Elias's only working tractor gave out with a violent, screeching mechanical groan, violently spewing thick, black smoke and boiling hot oil across his exhausted, sunburnt face and hands, leaving him standing entirely, alone in the center of his dead, ruined field, his large hands bleeding freely and his massive chest heaving with silent, dry sobs of absolute, overwhelming defeat. Clara had driven out to the farm earlier than usual that specific day, feeling a strange, heavy premonition settling deep in her bones, and she stepped out of her dusty truck just in time to witness him aggressively, pointlessly hurl his heavy iron wrench directly at the side of the smoking, dead machine. His usually rigid, impenetrable composure finally, spectacularly shattering into a million jagged, painful pieces right there in the suffocating heat of the afternoon sun. She walked slowly, deliberately toward him through the ankle-deep, choking dust, her long skirt dragging heavily over the dead, brittle crops, her face set in a mask of calm, unwavering resolve, entirely unafraid of the raw, masculine anger radiating off of him in waves, instinctively understanding that his explosive fury was not born of malice, but of deep, agonizing, terrified heartbreak over his absolute inability to provide for the land he loved. He saw her approaching and immediately, stubbornly turned away, aggressively swiping the mixture of dark grease and salty sweat from his tired eyes, his broad shoulders rising and falling rapidly as he fought desperately to rebuild the crumbling, invisible walls around his battered pride, his voice cracking with dry, raspy exhaustion when he finally spoke without looking at her, a harsh, defensive sound that completely lacked its usual, comforting rumble. "There's absolutely nothing left here for you to haul out here for, Clara," he stated flatly, his words deliberately sharp and designed to completely sever the tether between them. "The crop is completely dead, the ancient tractor is utterly ruined, and the bank is coming to take the land by the end of the very next month, so you need to turn that truck around and stop wasting your precious time on a sinking stone." She stopped exactly 3 feet behind him, the dry, hot wind violently whipping the loose strands of her hair across her face, completely ignoring his harsh, commanding tone, her voice ringing out clearly and steadily over the quiet hiss of the dying engine. "I didn't bring you any supplies today, Elias," she said simply, her tone entirely devoid of pity or dramatic flair, merely stating a plain, unalterable fact. "I came to help you fix the machine, same as we always do when things break down." He finally whirled around to face her, his eyes wild and dark with a mixture of immense anger and deep, hidden terror, completely unable to understand why she stubbornly refused to take the easy, gilded exit he was desperately offering her, his chest heaving as he finally voiced the heavy, unspoken insecurity that had been poisoning his mind since the day the rich merchant had arrived. "You don't understand, Clara. There is no fixing this," he shouted, his voice echoing loudly across the empty, desolate valley. "I have absolutely nothing to offer you, nothing but dirt and endless work and a mountain of impossible debt, while Arthur is waiting back in town completely ready to give you a soft life where you never have to scrub grease out of your fingernails or worry about the rain." He took a heavy, aggressive step toward her, his large, bleeding hands gesturing wildly to the ruined landscape around them, his voice dropping into a desperate, heartbreaking plea wrapped entirely in a rough, defensive shell. "You are far too smart and far too beautiful to rot out here in this dust with a broken man who can't even keep a single acre of corn alive," he insisted, the raw vulnerability finally leaking through his stoic facade. I said, "You deserve a wealthy man, someone who can actually give you the entire world without breaking a sweat. The silence that followed his outburst was incredibly heavy, filled only by the low, continuous howling of the warm wind sweeping down from the jagged peaks, tossing the dried dirt around their boots in tiny, swirling tornadoes as they stood locked in a tense, suspended standoff that seemed to stretch out into eternity. Clara did not flinch, she did not cry, and she did not dramatically run away as a lesser woman might have done. Instead, she merely closed the small, remaining distance between them with two slow, deliberate steps, reaching out with her pale, strong hands to gently but firmly grasp his trembling, grease-stained wrists, her touch instantly grounding him like a heavy iron anchor dropped suddenly into a turbulent, chaotic sea. She looked directly up into his dark, fearful eyes, her own hazel gaze entirely devoid of hesitation or doubt, perfectly reflecting the quiet, immense strength of the rugged valley that had forged them both, completely dismantling his intricate, defensive arguments with a devastatingly simple, undeniable truth that required no grand, theatrical delivery to carry the immense weight of the world. I don't care about Arthur, and I don't care about silks, and I don't give a damn about the bank, she whispered firmly, her voice low but carrying an absolute, unshakable finality that instantly silenced the loud, panicked screaming in his mind. I just want a loyal one. The massive, invisible dam that Elias had spent years meticulously building around his heart completely, silently collapsed in that exact moment. The profound, overwhelming relief washing over him in a physical wave that made his knees tremble, completely disarming his stubborn pride and laying bare the deep, enduring love he had harbored for her since the very first time she had left an apple on his railing. He did not pull her into a passionate, cinematic embrace or drop to his knees in a tearful, dramatic confession. Instead, he simply bowed his head, letting his forehead rest gently against hers, his rough thumbs slowly, instinctively tracing the soft line of her knuckles as they stood entirely, completely still together in the middle of the ruined, dying field, perfectly anchored in the eye of the storm. The shift in the atmosphere was immediate and profound. A quiet, mutual agreement that the pointless, exhausting fight was finally over, entirely replaced by a solid, unbreakable partnership that completely stripped away the terror of the impending ruin, reducing the massive, terrifying threat of losing the farm into nothing more than just another difficult chore they would quietly handle together. After a long, quiet moment, Elias slowly lifted his head, a very faint, dry smile finally touching the corners of his mouth as he looked down at the smoking, ruined tractor engine, the heavy burden of solitary responsibility completely lifted from his broad shoulders. It's going to take at least 3 days to rebuild that carburetor, he muttered softly, his voice returning to its familiar, comforting rumble, a direct, practical callback to their familiar routine. Then you better make sure the coffee isn't as weak as it was last week. Clara shot back instantly, a gentle, knowing humor lacing her tone as she finally released his hands and reached out to pick up the heavy, discarded iron wrench from the dirt, entirely ready to get back to the hard, necessary work of surviving. The hard rains finally, mercifully came 2 weeks later, breaking the historic drought with a violent, torrential downpour that quickly turned the cracked, dead earth into thick, heavy mud, washing away the suffocating dust and filling the empty reservoirs with cold, life-giving water, completely signaling the slow, painful beginning of their long, steady recovery. They did not have a grand, expensive wedding filled with flowers and loud music. They simply went down to the small, quiet courthouse on a rainy Tuesday morning, signed the necessary, legal papers, and immediately drove back to the struggling farm to aggressively mend the eastern fence line that had completely washed out in the heavy storm, celebrating their new union entirely through the quiet, shared intimacy of hard, physical labor. The slow, deliberate burn of their shared life together progressed entirely in rhythmic, repeating cycles of planting and harvesting, seasons of abundance closely followed by seasons of terrifying scarcity. But they weathered every single storm side by side, building a modest, enduring stability brick by brick and seed by seed, constantly relying on the deep, unspoken foundation of loyalty that completely, dwarfed any temporary, fleeting desire for material wealth. The loud, wealthy merchant Arthur entirely gave up his foolish pursuit within a month, completely baffled by Clara's baffling choice to choose dirt over diamonds, quickly leaving the quiet valley behind in a cloud of exhaust to seek far easier, more willing conquests in the distant city, becoming nothing more than a faint, amusing memory that Elias and Clara rarely ever bothered to mention. Instead, their lives became deeply intertwined with the very landscape itself, heavily marked by the physical, tangible improvements they made to the old farm, completely replacing the rusted hinges on the barn doors, finally patching the leaking roof with sturdy, new tin, and slowly, painstakingly paying off the heavy, looming debt to the cold, unfeeling bank until the vast acreage belonged entirely, undeniably to them. Decades slowly, inevitably slipped past them like the cold, rushing water in the ancient riverbed, turning Elias's thick, dark hair into a stark, striking white and carving deep, permanent lines around Clara's sharp, observant eyes, physically slowing their once powerful movements but entirely failing to dull the sharp, quick wit and profound, silent affection that permanently defined their unique, enduring bond. They remained fiercely independent and profoundly stubborn, continuing their old, familiar arguments about the most efficient way to stack winter firewood or the absolute necessity of fixing a slightly leaning fence post, finding a deep, comforting humor in their own rigid routines and completely relying on the heavy, subtextual banter that had always been their true love language. He would still entirely pretend to be casually resting by the front gate when she returned from town in their battered, reliable old truck, and she would still completely pretend not to notice the careful, deliberate way he always made sure a fresh, steaming cup of painfully bitter coffee was waiting exactly on the edge of the porch railing, their actions completely substituting for the grand, performative declarations they still entirely refused to vocalize. The physical landscape of the sprawling valley changed around them. New roads were paved and older, weaker farms completely folded under the relentless pressure of time. But their small, stubborn piece of the world remained a quiet, steadfast anchor, deeply rooted in the heavy soil and entirely sustained by the profound, enduring loyalty they had fiercely promised each other in the suffocating dust of a ruined field so many years ago. True wealth, they completely understood, was never actually found in the heavy balance of a bank account or the fleeting, shiny gleam of imported silk, but entirely in the quiet, absolute certainty that when the sky turns terrifyingly dark and the heavy engine finally brakes, there is someone standing right there beside you in the mud, entirely ready to pick up the wrench and quietly get to work. As we softly close the cover on this quiet, deeply resonant chapter of their enduring lives, taking one last, lingering look at the weathered, beautiful faces of two incredibly capable souls who simply refuse to be broken by the heavy world, we are deeply reminded that the most profound, lasting love stories are rarely ever the ones shouted loudly from the crowded rooftops, but rather ones gently, consistently whispered in the quiet spaces between the hardest, longest days. So, my friends, wherever you find yourself standing tonight, whether you are entirely surrounded by towering, concrete buildings or completely isolated by endless miles of empty prairie, I strongly encourage you to look closely at the steady, quiet hands that stubbornly help you carry your heaviest burdens, and firmly remember that the ultimate, truest luxury in this brief, chaotic life is simply finding someone deeply loyal enough to stubbornly hold the line when the bitter wind finally blows.